Boom shakalaka, ladies and gentlemen, freaks and geeks. I hope you can hear me. This is my first live broadcast on the YouTubes. Thought I might try it out. Yours truly, the Chocolate Nubian Soul Brother, is making videos for quite a number of years now, but I've never done a live broadcast. And as we are in a new year, I thought I would try something new. So I wanted to talk about something that I am very passionate about, something that I have been researching for years now, decades. And now I think about it, it's probably going on 3 decades. Been around a while. I've been into this stuff since I was a little kid. And you want to know what that is? Ladies and gentlemen, that is the topic of UFOs, extraterrestrials, the ancient origins of civilization. It all comes down to who we are. What's this all about? And as soon as you touch on this topic, most people think that you are a crazy conspiracy theorist. That word has become synonymous with irrationality. It's become synonymous with people that have drunk too much of the Kool-Aid. But if you look at this topic rationally, if you start to delve into the reports and you look at this with sincerity, with an open mind and a critical mind, you'd realize that this is the greatest story ever told. And there is more to this than this ridiculous notion that's perpetuated by the mainstream media of little green men from Mars. Well, story for you. Most of them are not from Mars. They are, well, they are from outside of the solar system. Zeta Reticuli, the Pleiades. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, when you look at this topic, there are a lot of areas, like with most subject matters, and you'll find that there are thousands, over 30,000 texts around the world talking about visitation from extraterrestrials. We have every civilization from the American Indians speaking about the Kachinas in West Africa, the Dogon, a tribe that has records of its interaction with extraterrestrials. North Africa, you have tales of the Anunnaki, or a race of people from the Sirius star constellation, and it ties back to the very foundation of Egypt. It deals with how the pyramids were built. Now, I know a lot of you are going to be very skeptical about this, so I'm going to break it down. I'm going to break it down into pretty much 3 categories. There's the ancient records, which deals with a lot of ancient texts covering civilizations that have had encounters with extraterrestrials. And then you have more modern accounts, researchers that have dealt with the abduction phenomenon. Back in the 80s, it was a massive thing. We had thousands, tens of thousands of people reporting abductions. But first things first, let's go back to the history of this. So if we have a look at Western civilization, we can go back to one of the oldest civilizations that we're aware of. That's modern-day Iraq. That's Babylon. It's between the Tigris and Euphrates Valley. You find this civilization, Sumeria. And this is 6,000 years ago, people. This is a time where people should have been wearing loincloths, should have been, well, not as advanced as I think what many scientists would report based off of that. But out of nowhere, we find this civilization highly advanced, have already developed many, many things that make up what we call a civilization. They're credited for the first agriculture, mathematics, law, religion, all the many things that we deem make up a society. This civilization, Sumeria, out of nowhere, this stuff erupts. And this is something you'll find in your encyclopedias. This is something that is well established within the scientific academia, that this civilization was responsible for many of the things that make up a civilization that were highly advanced. And the crazy thing is, wait for it. So these people, they say that, oh, they didn't create all of this stuff themselves. I mean, they weren't just magically able to conjure up all these advanced systems of mathematics and agriculture. No, according to their text, by the way, they have this writing called cuneiform writing. Basically, these stone tablets where you can engrave text into the stones. And they speak about how they got this knowledge from a race of people called the Anunnaki, which means those that from heaven came down. And they're making reference to the skies when they say heavens. And that's very, very bizarre that a civilization would accredit its amazing accomplishments, not to themselves, but to a race of people. More often than not, civilizations have a tendency to want to own stuff. They say, yeah, man, we made that shit. This is what black people do all the time. They're like, yeah, man, yeah, we made that shit. You see flying cars, the wheel, man, that was a black invention, yo. Brothers are always trying to take credit for shit. But no, we find the people of ancient Sumeria, Babylon, they talk about how they got all of this stuff from their ancestors called the Anunnaki. And they have this creation story called the Enuma Elish that maps out how this race of people called the Anunnaki came down and bestowed upon the ancient Sumerians this knowledge. Yeah, it is fascinating. It's very interesting stuff. And the crazy thing is, it would be one thing if this was a one-off occurrence. But strangely enough, this is the same thing you find in Egypt. In Egypt, they speak about the same kind of thing. There are a lot of commonalities. You have a look at, for instance, the formation of the pyramids. And the ancient Egyptians will say in their writings that essentially the Egyptians built the pyramids, but through the direction of the guardians of the sky. I quote, guardians of the sky. They make reference to these same people. And you have a look at not only the stories relating to this from ancient Egypt, but you have a look at how so much of it corresponds to the stories. For instance, you have a look at the Pyramid of Giza. The fact that this thing is aligned to true north, and it points to the Sirius star system, which apparently, according to the text, their ancient text, is where these star brothers, their gods, came from. All fascinating stuff. Anyway, I could talk about this for hours, but this is simply just one part of the world, or a couple of parts of the world. Egypt, Babylon. And, a lot of people say, understandably, a lot of things to debunk this. Like, we're just relying on anecdotal evidence here, right? I've heard this idea that if someone was to put a Bible in a time capsule, and we go 2,000 years into the future, and then there's some kind of massive cataclysm, and then people discover this time capsule 2,000 years later, and then they find this Bible, and then they find all of these stories about Adam and Eve. They'd be thinking, oh, well, this must be legit. But obviously, a lot of these stories are built off of air and imagination, or they are at least embellished to some extent. And they say that this is probably the same case with these stories in regards to the Anunnaki, that perhaps they're just biblical religious stories. And I would say that's a fair point. But it's not just the fact that this is a story. It's the fact that there is so much corresponding evidence to the story. We have a look at within, as I mentioned, the cuneiform writings. They not only have the story relating to how their gods, the Anunnaki, basically came down to planet Earth, which is a fascinating story in of itself. They talk about the planets within the solar system. Now, these people had an understanding of the planets within our solar system, and this is before Christopher Columbus, and it actually mapped this out within diagrammatical representations within these stone tablets. So there are diagrams essentially within the stone tablets where they make reference to the 10 planets. Sounds crazy, 10 planets, but they had the sun and 9 other planets. And the crazy thing is, this is the corresponding evidence I'm talking about. This is 6,000 years ago. Now, they'd mapped out planets that we only just discovered in the last century, like Pluto, and they described the color, the size of these planets, the orbiting patterns. So they had all of this evidence in regards to all of the planets within our solar system, and then they also speak about planets that we had not discovered at this point, and they also speak about another planet called Planet X, Nibiru, this planet which is supposed to have a 3,600-year elliptical orbit. And this happens to be the homeland of the Anunnaki, and how apparently every 3,600 years, the planet Nibiru comes in proximity to planet Earth and between Jupiter and Mars. And essentially at this point, the Anunnaki would leave the planet and come to planet Earth. Anyway, it's fascinating stuff. The interesting thing is they had all of this information within their writings. And then we learned so much information to verify a lot of this stuff, a lot of the things that you find within their creation stories. Now, bearing in mind, these stories have been translated by many people, and the variations that you get, one of the most well-known people to translate this is a guy by the name of Zecharia Sitchin, and I'm citing a lot of his work. And Zecharia Sitchin had somewhat of a dubious interpretation based off of the mainstream academia. But generally speaking, you'll find that there are hundreds of people that can translate this language, but they are generally arriving at the same thing, the idea of this race of people called the Anunnaki. So this isn't something, this story isn't something that has just been built of air and imagination. If you can actually read this language, the cuneiform writings, you'll find that more or less, it verifies what Zecharia Sitchin was translating, the idea of these planets, the idea of visitation from the Anunnaki. And then when you have a look at the corresponding evidence that we've even found over the last few years, for instance, in the story, they make reference to how the reason they left the Anunnaki, the reason why they left their planet, Planet X, was due to them experiencing some kind of problem through the sun. Apparently, the radiation from the sun was having a detrimental effect on their people, and part of the reason they came to planet Earth was to mine gold. Once again, sounds like a very fanciful story, but the idea was to use this gold and essentially sprinkle this into the atmosphere of their planet to protect them from the harmful effects of radiation. And it sounds like a fanciful idea, but then when you realize that that is actually a legitimate way, we've actually discovered now through science that using gold particles to actually protect a planet from radiation is something that is plausible. And you find that this is something that is written within the cuneiform writings, speaking about the Anunnaki, and you realize, oh, once again, corresponding evidence. This is something that is not just built up of air and imagination. And if it is, well, these people, the writers of this had a tremendous understanding about science and astrology, astronomy, and so forth. But anyway, I digress. This is just one area, the Anunnaki. But there's so many ancient civilizations that make reference to visitation. I mean, we can go back to the Vedas. This is the knowledge of India. They make reference to people tens of thousands of years ago. And the Vedas, these texts are referring to things that took place. I mean, according to them, now, granted, Westerners have dated these books to be only a few thousand years ago. The legit Indian scholars have said that these books are perhaps 10,000 years old, perhaps older than the Sumerian writings. And essentially, in these writings, they speak about these battles that would take place. They speak about these weapons that are very much like some of the weapons that we have in this day and age. They speak about weapons like the Brahmastra or the Pashupata. And the way that these things are described, they're described like radioactive weapons, like nuclear weapons. And you think to yourself, what on earth are people doing with nuclear weapons, radioactive weapons back thousands of years ago. And a lot of people say, oh, this is just fanciful writing, but then it comes back to the corresponding evidence. You find, for instance, that there are sites in India where there are radioactive tactites. And this is something that forms, this is glass, that forms where there have been nuclear explosions. And then you do the carbon testing, and you find that these places, these caves are thousands of years old. So there's obviously remnants of nuclear activity taking place. So once again, you have a look at the corresponding evidence. These are not just stories. And this is the biggest criticism I hear anytime I cite the many thousands. Once again, there are over 30,000 texts around the world speaking about visitations. And I barely touched on a fraction of this. But then you have a look at the corresponding evidence, and it makes you go, whoa. Once again, more. The Tuatha De Danann. If you're into your Irish folklore, you realize that this is the most fascinating thing. There is no distinction between the history of the Celts, Ireland, and the mythology. You find that at some point they're speaking about things that actually took place. And then you go back further, and their mythology, the folklore, is making references to things that the standard scientist would say, "Oh, this must be nonsense. Clearly they did not have these massive, powerful weapons. Therefore, it must be fiction." Well, one of the greatest myths is that myths are just myths, and the ancient Celts actually made reference to how Ireland came about, how they became such a knowledgeable people. The Druids, apparently, the Druids were taught their knowledge by a race of people called the Tuatha De Danann, who came from Hyperborea. According to the Celtic folklore, after these massive cataclysms, bearing in mind that pretty much all the ancient records, or a tremendous amount of them, show that at some point there was this great flood, the deluge. There were these massive cataclysms, and every civilization has reference to this. In the Celtic folklore, they speak about this, and they speak about how Ireland was one of the very few places that had survived these massive cataclysms. And the Tuatha De Danann, the tribe of the goddess Danu, essentially these incredibly advanced people discovered Ireland and imparted their knowledge. They taught the Druids an understanding about the flora, the fauna, about systems of science, metaphysics. So much of our understanding came from this culture. I mean, even Julius Caesar spoke about the ancient Druids as being incredibly dangerous because of the knowledge that they possessed, and actually took it upon himself at a point to dismantle them, because these people had a tremendous understanding, and they speak about how they got their knowledge. And essentially they got their knowledge from a race of people highly advanced, and a lot of people have theorized, namely Michael Sarian, highly recommend his material, about how these people may very well have been the Atlanteans, and whether or not this was a civilization that had formed itself through the normal course of evolution, or it had some kind of intervention. And when I say intervention, I'm making reference to another alien civilization. Who knows? But whether or not you want to go to ancient Ireland or go to the Norse mythology, the Edders, they're all speaking of advanced technologies, speaking about things that make you realize that at some point their trajectory, their evolution may have had some kind of interaction with a more advanced society. And we derive this because when you have a look at history, it tends to be linear. And when you see people coming out of nowhere with these advanced systems of technology, you ask, well, at least I ask, how did they get that? How did they arrive at that? And when they are telling you in their own texts where they got this stuff from, that it was through some kind of alien intervention, once again, it makes you go, what? So I find all of this very fascinating indeed. And, for a lot of the religious people out there, a lot of the Christians, a lot of people find this information very, very dubious, and they are unwilling to even open their minds to it because they've been indoctrinated with this idea that aliens and God do not go hand in hand, which I emphatically disagree with. I think the creator of this universe is is someone that that would not just have been limited to creating one planet. I think there's obviously a lot more to this universe than planet Earth, and it's been mathematically proven that the likelihood of life, just from a mathematical scientific perspective, is a certitude. There are over 400 billion stars within our galaxy alone, and God knows how many other galaxies. The universe truly is infinite, and the arrogance of people to presume that within this infinite creation, there's only one planet that has habitable life, and that the God, the Almighty Creator, is someone that only deemed it necessary to create one planet with life. I'm not so inclined to believe that. But the interesting thing is, for the strict Christians that believe in the Bible, it's fascinating to note that so many of the concepts that you find within the Bible are making references to concepts that are found within the creation story of ancient Babylon, the Enuma Elish. They make reference to a group of people called the Adama. Sound familiar? Adam? They also make reference to a place called Eden, which was the place where the first humans were. So I have to go briefly into the creation story, the Enuma Elish here. But essentially, the Anunnaki came to planet Earth, according to the creation story, in order to mine gold. But they found that it was too much work. Therefore, they genetically altered the natives of that time, and they were essentially, I would imagine, the Neanderthal man. And through genetic manipulation, which is not such a crazy concept. I mean, we are already doing things like this. I mean, more in the esoteric circles, but exoterically, we've been manipulating animals for decades now. And the idea of an advanced alien society being able to manipulate human beings and change the genome is not that far-fetched at all. But essentially, these people, the Anunnaki, manipulated the people of that land, these Neanderthals, and essentially created a worker race and used them to mine the gold. And these were the people, according to the creation story, were referred to as the Adama. And this all took place within a place called Eden. Now, I am just touching on the very surface of this. This is a very, very fascinating story, and I suggest people checking out the works of Zecharia Sitchin. He goes into detail with this. Michael Tsarion goes into a lot of detail, and also Michael Tellinger. Now, this is just the ancient accounts of visitation from extraterrestrials, and there is a tremendous amount of information dealing with that. This is an area that I'm very fascinated with. As I mentioned, I've been interested in this stuff for decades, but I first started off learning about the modern accounts of this, because a lot of people say, yeah, maybe these extraterrestrials they visited maybe hundreds and hundreds of years ago, but I don't think they're around now. And the people that say this, like I can typically tell how far someone is in their research into this field of ufology. I once met a ufologist. He called himself a ufologist, and he told me that he was a ufologist and he's researched this entire thing, and UFOs, aliens, they don't exist. And I thought to myself, oh, really? That's like saying I'm a doctor, and I've done a lot of research, and I don't believe that blood exists. I don't believe people get sick. It's like the entire field of ufology covers so many different areas that for someone to delve into it and not even touch on this thing, well, yeah, that's an interesting point. They are around, but they're not from this planet. Well, there are a lot of different theories on that. Fundamentally, you'll find, and I'm going to touch on this, like where did these aliens come from? And this is the difficulty. When people speak about aliens, they speak about it as if it's one group of people. You know, this, I hate synecdoche. When people make generalizations, they use an individual to represent the whole. I mean, there are many different factions of aliens. There's the Pleiadians, the Zeta Reticula. These are the Greys. There's the Reptilians. I mean, this goes into, and the thing is, this sounds like fanciful writing to most people because most people are very uninitiated into this world. But when I was a kid, around the age of 16, a friend of my dad's introduced to me into these books, but not books, basically documents. He somehow had access to this stuff, and these were unbelievably detailed accounts. It was called like Matrix, strangely enough, but hundreds, probably thousands of accounts of reported visitations, encounters, close encounters of the first kind. So this had been compiled by the U.S. military. And a lot of people say, "Oh, the government doesn't know this information. They're covering up." Well, the truth is, this is what it really comes down to. Within the governmental level, I mean, I know there's this massive disclosure project at the moment where the government's supposed to be releasing information about their encounters with extraterrestrials. That's only one level of this. I don't believe that the government, when I say the government, as in the mainstream government, we're talking people like Obama, Donald Trump, the people that are the figures, have a real clear understanding of what is going on in this alien agenda. They still make references to SETI and trying to discover radio signals from extraterrestrial life. But the reality is that there are circles within the government, black ops. Bob Lazar has made reference to this, and this is well established. And I'm saying this because this isn't a case of me reading one report. When you read many, many, many reports, you cross-reference information, you start seeing a theme here. You start seeing a theme that, one, that the secret government, a name that is often mentioned anytime you delve into this area, is the naval intelligence. So this part of the U.S. military has been dealing in this realm. Black ops, a tremendous amount of money, tax dollars go into these secret areas. And there have been many people like Phil Snyder, that have come out and spoken about this kind of stuff. Anyway, I digress. I think we're talking about the origins of UFOs, and I was talking about this documentation that I started reading around the age of 16 that delves into all these reports that make reference to many, many encounters. And here's the thing. When it comes to anecdotal evidence, when it comes to hearsay, the scientific community understandably has the idea that if something is anecdotal, it doesn't have as much credibility. And what I say to that is, one, I think, first of all, anecdotal evidence is actually quite reliable if you are hearing it from a reliable source, and if you were hearing it over and over and over again. Once again, if this was just one account, I wouldn't give it that much credibility. But when you have thousands, tens and thousands of reports, and you find similar themes, back in the 80s, this was such an epidemic. There were so many people that were reporting to have been kidnapped by these extraterrestrials, and these are well-established reports. In fact, they actually made a movie out of this. I think it was called Communion, or Intruders, rather. And the same themes: implantation, the fact that you'd find these devices that would be found within these subjects. The common themes that you find within these stories is what leads you to give it more credibility. I mean, unless, of course, people are having some combined hallucination, thousands of people around the world, they're all reporting people, these alien entities that have slit eyes, insectoid-like features, and you're seeing the same things when you're hearing descriptions of reptilians. And I could go into the many different factions of extraterrestrials and so forth, but when you were reading so much literature and you're seeing these themes over and over again, it leads more credibility to it. So in regards to this entire topic, when you delve into it a little, understandably, the first reaction is, I don't know about this extraterrestrial nonsense. It all seems like nonsense to me. I don't give much credibility to it. But when you delve deeper into it, you start to piece together the truth. You start cross-referencing all this information. And for someone like myself that has delved into this was my first passion when it comes to anything to do with research. Granted, I've been interested in a lot of things growing up as a kid, all the weird science, but I would say ufology is the one area that I found most fascinating because it ties to what's really going on. Like, once you tap into this agenda, you realize that there have been a lot of secret agendas in history that tie to this, tie to secret societies, tied to, and this topic is not something that can really be covered within, definitely within one podcast. You know, it might be something that I tap into later, but I would highly recommend the works of Michael Desarian. He's someone that delves into the origins of civilization. One of his books I found very, very insightful. It's called The Irish Origins of Civilization. He goes into how Ireland has this tradition of Celtic folklore that actually speaks about these, races of people that essentially pave the way to our development and so forth. But he also touches on the alien agenda as well, about how we've been visited by many extraterrestrials, and there's a lot of evidence to support this. Michael Tellinger is another good one. Then, of course, some of the more well-known figures like David Icke. And David Icke synthesized a lot of the works of Jordan Maxwell. Jordan Maxwell would probably be the grandfather of this information. People that are familiar with David Icke should be familiar with Jordan Maxwell, because most of the stuff that you were hearing from David Icke is essentially the works of Jordan Maxwell. Jordan Maxwell actually brought David Icke into the States, and his knowledge is extensive. But this is just me going through a few names. These are some people that have imparted knowledge to me that have really helped me gain a better understanding of this whole alien agenda. So highly recommend their works. But a few other names are Lloyd Pye. If you really want to understand, I mean, I barely touched the surface of this creation story, the Enuma Elish, dealing with the Anunnaki and how they genetically modified human beings according to the creation story. Lloyd Pye goes into the real science, like the scientific evidence showing how there are genetic abnormalities within the human genome that show that it has definitely gone through some cross-hybridization. So highly recommend Lloyd Pye. Then there's, of course, Eric von Daniken. He goes into the ancient histories front. Other people, Mark Passio, if you're into the whole truth movement, he pretty much surmises a lot of the works of Michael Desarian, Lloyd Pye, and many of the other figures that I mentioned. He's got some great work on this in his What is Happening podcast. There's a segment, I think it's called Cosmic Abandonment, which I think you can find on YouTube. Highly recommend that. Emmanuel Belikovsky, he's one of the old school figures. Now, there are a lot more modern figures that I barely even touched on that talk about this agenda. CE4. I'm not familiar with CE4. I'm familiar with S4. That's the base not far from Roswell, the Roswell site, which is another fascinating thing that I'll have to get into another time. But I would highly recommend people checking out Phil Snyder. This guy is, to me, he's got the most fascinating story because he's someone that had a high-level clearance. I mean, this is the thing. Like, there's a lot of anecdotal stories you hear about this stuff, thousands of years ago, dealing with extraterrestrial visitation. But there are actual figures that have actually, like people like Phil Snyder, that worked for government, dark ops, that had high-level clearances. Phil Snyder had a Rhyolite clearance. Apparently, this is one of the highest clearances you had. And he actually worked on the S4 site. So there's this. A lot of people wonder what's going on with Area 51, Roswell, that kind of stuff. Well, the bigger question is what's going on in S4. It's this massive base, underground base, and people that have been there have actually worked there, like Phil Snyder. God bless his soul. He was assassinated. And we know this because anytime he would talk about this, he would say that if he ever got assassinated or ever was found to have committed suicide, that it would have been an assassination because he would never take his life. And even as he was conducting these lectures and talking about how people are trying to take away his life, he would mention this, and his life was very much at risk for coming out and talking about this. But Phil Snyder is probably the most fascinating story because here is a guy that actually worked in these underground bases. Talks about how he ended up having firefights, shootouts with extraterrestrials that were deep within subterranean networks that essentially they were building into the ground. And this ties into another story. Well, it's not a story. I mean, this is basically history, dealing with why these reptilians are within the planet, dealing with how, I mean, you hear about these stories in ancient texts, biblical stories about demons and creatures living under the ground in hell. And it's quite possibly referencing the fact that these creatures, these reptilians, and there is a whole story to this, I will go into this another time, are actually there. And anyway, I digress. Phil Snyder ended up, through his work, encountering these extraterrestrials, and he had scars to prove it. He had horrible burns from the energy weapons that they would use. Anyway, I realize this all sounds incredibly fanciful, and it sounds like a ridiculous science fiction story, but yeah, the truth is a lot crazier than what you could even imagine it to be. There's a lot of things that go on in this world outside of what the mainstream tell us, and this entire agenda is something that I think is one of them, and it's worthwhile looking into. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to leave it there. It's my first live broadcast. Peace out. Keep it real. I'll keep you informed the next time I'm going to drop on here and talk about some other crazy conspiracy theories that are actually not just built of air and imagination, but are based on truth. Signing out. Boom shakalaka. Your chocolate Nubian soul brother. Until next time. Ow!